My husband's elite family paid me $5 million to walk away so he could marry his pregnant mistress and secure his precious bloodline. I took their hush money without shedding a single tear and moved across the world. But while they were busy planning the society wedding of the decade, the real medical records landed on my desk, proving that my ex-husband was completely sterile. The twins his mistress was carrying belonged to someone else entirely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a toxic family try to tear you down to protect their golden child. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I used their own money to buy their entire empire. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and the defining moment of my life did not happen with a scream or a dramatic argument. It happened with the crisp, quiet sound of heavy paper sliding across a polished mahogany table. The $5 million cashier's check came to a halt right in front of me, its bold zeros staring up at me like a cruel mockery of my 5-year marriage. Across from me sat my mother-in-law, Vivian Davenport, the undisputed queen bee of Atlanta's most influential megachurch and the ruthless matriarch of the Davenport Family Fund. She sat perfectly erect, wearing her signature Chanel suit, her face a mask of perfectly contoured disdain. "Take it," Nia Vivian said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Vanessa is carrying twin boys. Julian needs heirs for the Davenport legacy, and your womb has been empty for 5 years. It is time for you to step aside and let a real woman take your place." I slowly looked up from the check. Beside Vivian sat my husband Julian, the man who had once stood before 500 guests and vowed to love me in sickness and in health, was currently staring a hole into the imported Persian rug, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked like a scolded child rather than the 33-year-old chief executive officer of a massive investment firm. His hand was tightly gripping the fingers of the woman sitting next to him. That woman was Vanessa. She was 25, a light-skinned former Instagram model who had recently clawed her way into our high society circles. She had spent the last year playing the sweet, innocent victim at every charity gala and church luncheon, subtly undermining me while smiling to my face. Right now, she was doing what she did best. Vanessa rested her free hand on her barely visible baby bump and forced a dramatic sob that echoed through the massive, silent dining room. "Please, Nia," she whimpered, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue. "I never meant to hurt you. I really did not. But Julian and I are so deeply in love. These babies need a real home, a complete family. You have to understand. You cannot give him what he needs as a man. Do the right thing for the children. Let him go." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer audacity of the scene before me. For 5 long years I had endured the suffocating weight of the Davenport family expectations. As an outsider who had built my own successful art consulting business from the ground up, rather than riding on old money coattails, I was never considered good enough for Vivian. While her friends spent their days hosting lavish garden parties and comparing their designer outfits, I was on flights to Paris and New York, negotiating gallery spaces, and securing commissions for emerging artists. My financial independence intimidated them. I did not come from a legacy family. I was not part of the Divine Nine fraternities and sororities, nor did I belong to the exclusive Jack and Jill chapters that dictated their strict social hierarchy. I was just a hardworking girl who dared to marry the Prince of Atlanta. Julian had fought for me back then. He had held my hand and promised me that his family's toxic obsession with bloodlines and social status did not matter. But now that same man sat in cowardly silence while his mother and his mistress humiliated me in my own dining room. Vivienne leaned forward, tapping her manicured fingernail against the heavy wood of the table. "We are being more than generous, Nia. This money is enough for you to disappear quietly. Go start a new life, somewhere far away from Atlanta. The media will be told that the divorce is amicable and entirely private. You will not speak to the press. You will not cause a scene at my church. In exchange, you walk away a very wealthy woman. But if you try to fight us in court, I promise you I will drag your reputation through the mud so thoroughly that no gallery in this country will ever do business with you again. You will be completely ruined." The threat hung heavy in the air, practically suffocating the room. Julian finally looked up, his expression a sickening mix of pity, guilt, and sheer arrogance. "Just sign the papers, Nia," he muttered, sliding a thick legal folder across the table to join the check. "The doctor said your condition is permanent. The severe scarring on your ovaries. It is irreversible. I need a son to take over the family fund one day. You know how important the Davenport legacy is to my mother and to the community. I am sorry, but Vanessa is giving me what you cannot." The mention of my supposed medical condition felt like a brutal physical blow to my chest, but I refused to let them see me bleed. For the past 2 years, Julian and I had been quietly visiting Dr. Wallace, the highly esteemed Davenport family physician. Every test, every painful and invasive procedure had pointed to me as the problem. Dr. Wallace had sat me down just 3 months ago, shaking his head with rehearsed sympathy, telling me that I was entirely barren. The guilt had eaten me alive. I had spent countless nights crying on the cold bathroom floor, apologizing to Julian for failing him as a wife, while he held me and told me we would get through it together. And all that time, while I was mourning the children I thought I could never have, he had been sleeping with Vanessa in luxury hotel rooms paid for by his mother. I looked at the three of them. Vivian, with her cold, calculating eyes that only saw people as pawns on a chessboard. Julian, the pathetic mama boy, who valued his public image over his wedding vows. And Vanessa, the opportunistic snake waiting to claim my throne and my house. They expected me to break down. They wanted me to scream, to throw my crystal water glass against the wall, to beg Julian to stay, or to angrily tear up the check in a fit of injured pride. They wanted a performance that would justify their cruelty. They wanted to prove to themselves that I was just an unstable, emotional woman who never truly belonged in their elite, refined world. Instead, a strange, icy calm washed over my entire body. The fog of guilt and inadequacy that had clouded my mind for years suddenly lifted, leaving behind a crystal-clear vision of reality. I was not losing a family today. I was being handed the key to my ultimate freedom, fully funded by the very people who thought they were destroying my life. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my favorite Mont Blanc fountain pen. The satisfying click of the cap being removed made Vanessa flinch slightly, as if she expected me to use it as a weapon. Without uttering a single word, I opened the leather-bound legal folder. I skimmed the divorce agreement. It was ironclad, heavily favoring the Davenports, stripping me of any claim to the estate, the luxury cars, or the family business. But it also severed every single legal tie I had to them forever. I placed the pen on the paper and signed my name on the dotted line. My signature was smooth, steady, and entirely unapologetic. I flipped to the next page and signed again. Page after page, I gave away my rights to the summer home in Martha Vineyard, the shared investment portfolios, and the joint bank accounts. I gave away my claim to the antique furniture we had picked out together in Italy. I did not pause to wipe away tears because there were none. I did not hesitate. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp scratching of my pen against the thick parchment paper. Each stroke of the pen felt less like a surrender and more like the snapping of heavy chains that had kept me bound to this miserable family. When I finished signing the last document, I closed the folder meticulously and slid it back across the table toward Julian. Then I reached out and picked up the $5 million cashier's check. I folded it neatly in half and tucked it into the inner pocket of my purse. Julian stared at me, his jaw slightly slack, his brow furrowed in deep, uncomfortable confusion. "That is it?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You are not going to fight this. You are just going to take the money and leave." I stood up slowly from the table, smoothing out the skirt of my dress. I looked down at the man I had dedicated my entire 20s to, feeling nothing but absolute hollow disgust. "You offered me a buyout, Julian. I am a businesswoman. I recognize a highly profitable exit when I see one." Vivian let out a haughty, satisfied laugh, leaning back in her chair. "I told you she was just a gold digger at heart," she sneered to her son, though she kept her eyes fixed triumphantly on me. "She does not care about you, Julian. She only cares about the payout. Let her go back to the bottom where she belongs. Good riddance." I picked up my purse, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and looked directly into Vivian's eyes. The matriarch looked so incredibly smug, so confident in her flawless victory. She truly believed she had bought her son's happiness, secured her family's pristine public image, and disposed of the trash. She had absolutely no idea that the foundation of her entire grand empire was built on a massive, humiliating lie. "Enjoy the wedding, Vivian," I said, my voice eerily calm, steady, and projecting clearly across the massive room. "And congratulations on the twin boys, Julian. I am sure they will be everything you deserve. But remember one thing before you start engraving those expensive silver baby rattles." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I let my gaze shift from Julian's confused face to Vanessa's suddenly nervous expression, and finally back to Vivian's cold, calculating stare. I offered them a slow, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. Biology has a very wicked sense of humor. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand oak double doors of the dining room. I did not look back when I heard Vanessa ask Julian what I meant by that. I did not wait for their response. As I stepped out of the mansion, walking past the oil portraits of Davenport ancestors and out into the warm, humid Atlanta night air, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The valet had already brought my car around. My luggage was hastily packed and waiting in the trunk placed there by Vivian's staff. They had planned this ambush down to the last detail, expecting to physically throw me out if I resisted. I handed the valet a crisp $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat of my car, and locked the doors. I sat there for a brief moment, gripping the leather steering wheel, staring up at the massive glowing windows of the estate. I could see their silhouettes moving in the dining room, celebrating their hollow victory. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, prepared to deposit the millions that would fund my new life. Then I booked a one-way first-class ticket to London. The Davenports thought they had discarded me. They thought they had buried me under the weight of their money and their immense social influence. They did not realize they had just fully funded their own destruction. The tires of my British Airways flight touched down on the damp tarmac at Heathrow Airport, and with that slight physical jolt, my past officially became dead to me. I stepped out into the crisp, overcast London morning, breathing in air that tasted sharply of anonymity and limitless potential. By the time I reached my temporary luxury suite at the Savoy Hotel, my phone was already buzzing continuously with frantic texts from Atlanta numbers I did not recognize. They were likely Vivian flying monkeys, trying to ensure I had safely left the country and kept my mouth shut. I ignored every single one of them, removed my SIM card, and dropped it into my half-finished cup of morning tea. Then I got straight to work. I did not waste a single day mourning a man who had never truly loved me, or a family that had viewed me as nothing more than a defective incubator for their precious legacy. Instead, I opened my laptop and immediately routed Vivian $5 million payoff through a complex labyrinth of high-yield offshore accounts spanning from the Cayman Islands to Switzerland. I diversified the massive funds into aggressive tech startups and premium real estate investment trusts, ensuring that the Davenport hush money was working for me every single second of the day. Within 2 short weeks, I had leveraged my newly acquired capital to lease a sleek, glass-walled office space in the heart of Mayfair. I legally registered my new enterprise and hired a small but ruthless team of researchers and legal experts. I was no longer just an independent art consultant playing in the minor leagues of the American South. I was now the founder and principal director of my own international brokerage specializing in securing hyper-rare contemporary pieces for ultra-high net worth individuals. The London art scene was notoriously insular, heavily dominated by old-money European brokers who initially looked at a young Black American woman with polite, thinly veiled amusement. They assumed I was entirely out of my depth. They assumed I lacked the connections and the pedigree to survive in their Shark Tank. They assumed entirely wrong. My first major power play came exactly 4 months after I arrived in the United Kingdom. A highly reclusive tech mogul from Dubai had retained my exclusive services with a singular, extremely difficult demand. He wanted a specific undocumented Jean-Michel Basquiat painting currently hidden in a private collection in Geneva, and he was willing to pay an absolute fortune to acquire it. The major problem was that a prominent French broker named Laurent had been aggressively negotiating for that exact same piece for over a year on behalf of a Russian oligarch. Laurent had impeccable pedigree, generations of family wealth, and the insufferable arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. We eventually met at a private viewing inside a heavily guarded Swiss banking vault. Laurent stood before the vibrant, chaotic canvas, swirling his espresso, barely acknowledging my presence in the room. He loudly offered the seller 22 million euros, boasting that absolutely no one else in the room possessed the immediate liquid capital to match his generous offer. He expected me to quietly pack up my leather briefcase, admit defeat, and take the next flight back to London. Instead, I stepped forward and pulled out a meticulously researched financial dossier I had spent weeks compiling with my team. I did not offer 23 million to outbid him. I offered exactly 20 million, but I slid a secondary legal contract directly across the steel table to the seller. I had uncovered through rigorous investigation that the seller was facing a massive undocumented tax liability in the United States regarding a completely different real estate asset. I had already arranged a perfectly legal, airtight corporate structuring loophole that would save the seller nearly $6 million in international capital gains taxes if they sold the painting exclusively through my specific firm. Laurent practically choked on his espresso. He knew brushstrokes and canvas history, but he did not know ruthless modern financial architecture. The seller signed my contract immediately, completely ignoring the French broker's sputtering, desperate protests. I secured the Basquiat, earned a massive seven-figure commission for my firm in a single afternoon, and instantly established my undeniable reputation as the most lethal new player in the European art market. I celebrated that evening by drinking vintage champagne alone on the balcony of my newly purchased penthouse overlooking the River Thames. I was building an impenetrable empire brick by solid brick, funded entirely by the severance package of my own misery. While I was conquering the European art world and mingling with global billionaires, my ex-husband was busy performing in a tragic circus of his own making back in Atlanta. Through a mutual friend who had quietly remained loyal to me, I received a video clip that perfectly encapsulated the hollow, pathetic reality of the Davenport family. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and Vivian had orchestrated a massive, ostentatious gender reveal party at the most exclusive country club in Buckhead. She had spared absolutely no expense to ensure the entire black elite of the city was present to witness the glorious triumph of her bloodline. The manicured lawn was crowded with prominent local politicians, wealthy megachurch pastors, and legacy families who dictated the social hierarchy of the city. The men were proudly sporting their Omega Psi Phi and Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity colors, smoking expensive cigars and discussing stock portfolios. The women stood around in their impeccable Jack and Jill pearls, sipping custom-crafted cocktails and gossiping maliciously behind freshly manicured hands. At the absolute center of this chaotic Vanity Fair stood Julian and Vanessa. They looked exactly like the perfect wealthy power couple on the glossy surface, but anyone with a discerning eye could easily see the massive cracks forming in their fragile public facade. Vanessa was draped in a custom silk maternity gown that cost more than most luxury vehicles, clinging to Julian's arm, like a shiny designer accessory. She was expertly playing the role of the glowing mother, to be laughing a little too loudly at unfunny jokes, and constantly shifting her posture to make sure the hired event photographers captured her from every flattering angle. She paraded around the lawn, accepting lavish gifts and soaking up the jealous admiration of the other women. Julian, however, looked completely and utterly exhausted. The dark, heavy circles under his eyes were clearly visible even through the low resolution of the cell phone video. He forced a stiff smile whenever the cameras flashed in his direction, but his broad shoulders were slumped, and he kept darting his eyes around the massive crowd as if he was desperately searching for an emergency escape route. He was a man completely trapped inside a gilded cage of his mother, making suffocating under the crushing weight of an alpha male image he could never truly live up to in reality. When the highly anticipated time came for the big reveal, Vivian confidently stepped up to the microphone, practically radiating with narcissistic pride. She gave a long, self-congratulatory speech about the unmatched strength of the Davenport legacy and the divine blessing of new life. She even managed to weave in a few subtle, passive-aggressive remarks about how her son had finally found a woman truly capable of fulfilling her natural God-given duties to the family. The affluent crowd applauded politely, though a few people exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances. Then Julian and Vanessa stepped up to a massive custom-built box wrapped in gold ribbon. On the count of 3, they pulled the heavy ribbons. Thousands of bright blue confetti pieces and hundreds of helium balloons shot violently into the sky, accompanied by the loud popping of champagne corks and a rehearsed, deafening cheer from the crowd. Twin boys! The prestigious Davenport name was finally secure for another generation. Vanessa threw her arms dramatically around Julian's neck, kissing him deeply for the cameras, while Vivian wiped a perfectly timed theatrical tear from her eye. They were the absolute picture of high society perfection. But as I sat watching that video from my luxurious, quiet London office surrounded by millions of dollars in acquired assets and a peaceful life I completely controlled, I did not feel a single ounce of jealousy or regret. I only felt profound pity. They were aggressively celebrating a massive lie. They were popping vintage champagne over a strict medical impossibility. Every single person standing on that manicured country club lawn was buying into a sick delusion orchestrated by a desperate mother and a cowardly, spineless son. Julian was proudly parading around with a woman who was carrying another man's children, completely oblivious to the devastating fact that his own biology had betrayed him long ago. They had happily traded my silence for $5 million, truly thinking they had secured their perfect, untouchable future. They had absolutely no idea that the timer on their explosive secret was already ticking down rapidly, and when the ugly truth finally detonated in front of their elite community, the resulting blast radius would permanently destroy everything they had ever built. 6 months into my new life, my firm was operating at a level of prestige I had once only dreamed of in Atlanta. I had completely detached myself from the suffocating Southern society rules that dictated women should be quiet, agreeable, and solely defined by their husbands' bank accounts. I was in London, and here power was the only currency that truly mattered. It was a cold Tuesday evening when I arrived at Sotheby's for a highly exclusive invitation-only auction featuring contemporary African art. I was there on behalf of a notoriously demanding client who wanted a specific piece, a striking bronze sculpture by a rising Senegalese artist. I took my seat near the front of the lavishly decorated auction room, wearing a sharply tailored emerald green suit that commanded absolute attention. The room was packed with European aristocrats, venture capitalists, and legacy collectors. I flipped through the glossy catalog, completely focused on my target. When the sculpture was finally brought onto the stage, the heavy velvet curtains pulling back to reveal its stunning metallic curves, a quiet murmur rippled through the elite crowd. The auctioneer, a tall British man with a booming voice, started the bidding at £2 million. I raised my numbered paddle immediately. 2.5, I called out, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I expected a swift victory. I had aggressively outmaneuvered the competition on my last 3 acquisitions, and my reputation in the room was already established. But before the auctioneer could even acknowledge my bid, a deep, resonant voice echoed from the back of the room. 3 million. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit rows of antique wooden chairs, until I found the source of the interruption. He was sitting casually in the last row, his long legs crossed, projecting an aura of absolute unbothered confidence. He wore a perfectly fitted midnight blue tuxedo, with no tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He was strikingly handsome, with dark skin, a sharp jawline, and piercing brown eyes that were currently locked directly onto mine. I did not know his name yet, but I instantly recognized the dangerous, calculating energy radiating from him. He was not old money. He did not have the lazy, entitled posture of a man who had inherited his wealth. He had the sharp, hungry look of a predator who had built his empire from the ground up. 3.5, I countered loudly, turning my attention straight back to the auctioneer. I refused to let some arrogant stranger intimidate me out of a commission. 4 million, the man replied instantly, not missing a single beat. The crowd began to whisper excitedly. 5 million, I shot back, gripping my paddle tightly. 5.5, he said, his voice dropping an octave, practically purring with amusement. I knew my client's absolute limit was 6 million. I had to end this immediately before he drove the price into an unacceptable range. 6 million, I announced, standing up slowly from my chair, turning to face him fully. I stared him down with a look of pure icy warning. I am not playing a game, my eyes told him. He held my gaze for 5 agonizingly long seconds. The entire room fell completely silent, waiting to see who would blink first. Then slowly, a devastatingly charming smile spread across his face. He respectfully tilted his head toward me and lowered his paddle. Going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the green suit for 6 million pounds, the auctioneer shouted. Slamming his wooden gavel down hard, I let out a slow breath, smoothed my jacket and walked toward the private payment lounge to finalize the massive transaction. I had barely signed the final wire transfer authorization when the heavy oak door swung open behind me. It was him. Up close, he was even more imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, carrying a tumbler of scotch. Dominic Banks, he said, extending a large, warm hand toward me. I apologize for running up the price on your sculpture. I just wanted to see how far you were willing to go. I took his hand, my grip just as firm as his. Nia Davenport, I replied smoothly, and you just cost my client an extra £1 million just to test my limits. Dominic laughed, a rich, vibrant sound that filled the small room. Well, Nia Davenport, you have an incredibly intimidating poker face. I am the founder of a cybersecurity tech firm here in London. I came tonight looking to buy something beautiful for my new corporate headquarters, but I think I found something infinitely more captivating. He did not say it like a cheesy pickup line. He said it like a stark, undeniable statement of fact. His directness caught me off guard. In the rigid, judgmental world of Atlanta, high society men spoke in coded circles. Julian had always been obsessed with appearances, carefully filtering every word to ensure it aligned with his mother's strict church standards. Dominic was the exact opposite. He did not care about the pretentious rules of engagement. He looked at me with open, unapologetic admiration, not for my family lineage or my social standing, but for the ruthless business acumen I had just displayed on the auction floor. Over the next several weeks, Dominic Banks systematically dismantled every defensive wall I had spent years building around my heart. He did not court me with the traditional boring dinner dates that the Davenport men utilized. He treated me like an equal partner in a high-stakes corporate merger. On our first date, he flew us by private helicopter to his massive estate in the Scottish Highlands just to show me his private art collection and ask for my professional critique. He actually listened when I spoke. He engaged with my mind, challenging my opinions on global markets and modern expressionism. He never once asked me about my parents, my sorority affiliations, or what church I attended. When I finally told him the brutal truth about my divorce, about the $5 million hush money, and the forged infertility diagnosis that Vivian had used to exile me, he did not offer me hollow pity. He poured me a glass of 50-year-old scotch, leaned across his massive glass desk, and looked at me with eyes full of dangerous respect. You took their money and used it to become a kingmaker, he said softly, shaking his head in sheer awe. Nia, they completely underestimated you. They thought they were burying a victim, but they planted a seed instead. That was the exact moment I realized I was falling deeply in love with him. Dominic saw the ruthless survivor in me, and instead of being intimidated by my strength like Julian had been, he practically worshipped it. Our romance escalated with breathtaking speed, operating in a stratosphere of wealth and power that the Davenports could never even begin to comprehend. We became an unstoppable, highly visible power couple in the European elite circuit. We attended private galas in Monaco, spent weekends racing vintage cars in Lake Como, and hosted lavish charity dinners at his penthouse in Mayfair. Dominic bought me custom jewelry not to claim ownership over me, but to celebrate my corporate victories. When my firm closed a massive deal acquiring a collection of stolen antiquities for a national museum, he surprised me by renting out the entire Louvre Museum in Paris for a private midnight dinner, just the two of us. It was intoxicating. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly seen, fully appreciated, and completely secure. I was no longer the outsider trying desperately to fit into a rigid, hostile family structure. I was a queen reigning alongside a king who actually deserved my loyalty. And the most beautiful part of our entire relationship was the absolute secrecy of our location relative to my past. Because we operated strictly within European billionaire circles, our lives were completely off the radar of the petty gossip-obsessed Atlanta society that Julian and Vivian desperately clung to. They had no idea that while they were busy playing dress-up at country club gender reveal parties and desperately trying to maintain their fragile public image, I was literally sitting on top of the world. Dominic was a self-made man, a brilliant coder who had built a cybersecurity empire from a tiny apartment in Brixton. His journey commanded a level of authentic respect that Julian, who merely managed the wealth his grandfather had built, could never achieve. Dominic understood the precise weight of ambition. We spent countless nights awake until dawn, mapping out our respective business empires on the massive whiteboard in his home office, drinking espresso, and strategizing hostile takeovers. I helped him refine his corporate branding utilizing my keen eye for aesthetics, while he provided me with exclusive insider knowledge regarding tech startups that needed aggressive seed funding. My initial $5 million investment portfolio tripled under his expert guidance, skyrocketing my personal net worth into the tens of millions. We were not just building a life together, we were forging an absolute dynasty. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, the Davenport facade was slowly beginning to crack under its own immense weight. The elite circles of Atlanta were notoriously fickle, and rumors had started to circulate regarding the true nature of my sudden, extremely quiet departure. Vivian spent most of her days frantically doing damage control, throwing more lavish luncheons and donating massive sums of money to the mega church building fund just to keep the congregation whispering favorably about her son. She forced Julian and Vanessa to attend every single high society event, parading them around like prize-winning show ponies. But the harder she pushed the narrative of their perfect, blessed union, the more obvious their misery became. Julian looked increasingly haggard, drinking heavily at social events, while Vanessa grew demanding and volatile, constantly threatening to take the babies and leave if she did not get her way. They were trapped in a miserable prison of their own design, slowly suffocating under the heavy weight of their massive lies. They foolishly thought I had completely vanished into a life of quiet, pathetic obscurity. They did not realize I had relocated to a much higher vantage point, waiting patiently for the absolute perfect moment to strike. That perfect moment, however, was about to be accelerated by a biological plot twist I could never have anticipated. It was 4 months into my relationship with Dominic. We were attending an ultra-exclusive winter gala at a historic mansion in Mayfair, hosted by a prominent British aristocrat. The grand ballroom was a blinding sea of diamond necklaces and bespoke tuxedos, filled with the most influential financial players in Europe. I was wearing a floor-length crimson silk gown that Dominic had specially commissioned for me from a private designer in Milan. I felt utterly invincible. We had just spent the last hour effortlessly charming the board members of a massive Scandinavian tech conglomerate securing a lucrative partnership for Dominic firm. He stood beside me, his hand resting possessively on my lower back, as a waiter offered us fresh flutes of vintage champagne. I reached for the crystal glass, but as my fingers brushed the delicate stem, a sudden violent wave of nausea slammed directly into my chest. The bright chandeliers above me seemed to violently sway, blurring into brilliant streaks of white light. A loud ringing sound erupted in my ears, drowning out the classical string quartet playing in the corner of the room. I tried to take a deep breath to steady myself, but the heavily perfumed air of the ballroom felt impossibly thick and suffocating. I gripped Dominic's arm tightly, my nails digging into the dark wool of his tuxedo jacket. Dominic turned to me, his confident smile instantly vanishing when he saw my pale face. Before I could even form the words to tell him I felt unwell, the marble floor rushed up to meet me. The last thing I heard before slipping into total darkness was the sound of my champagne flute shattering against the stone and Dominic shouting my name. When I finally opened my eyes, the opulent ballroom had been replaced by the pristine, stark white walls of a private medical suite. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoed in the quiet room. I was lying in a hospital bed, an intravenous line taped securely to the back of my hand. Dominic was sitting in a chair drawn flush against the mattress, gripping my free hand with a fierce intensity. He looked immaculate as always, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched near his temple. When he realized I was awake, a profound look of relief washed over his features. He pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles and told me I was at the Wellington Hospital, an elite private facility in London. He had bypassed the public emergency services completely, utilizing his personal security team to transport me directly to the top medical specialists in the city. Before I could ask what had caused my sudden collapse, the heavy wooden door of the suite opened. A tall, distinguished-looking physician with silver hair walked into the room holding a sleek digital tablet. He introduced himself as Dr. Arrington, the chief of internal medicine. His expression was completely unreadable, perfectly schooled into absolute professional neutrality. He asked me how I was feeling, checking my vitals and the monitors beside my bed. I told him I felt exhausted but physically fine, insisting that it must have been simple dehydration or the overwhelming heat of the crowded gala. Dr. Arrington offered a small, polite smile and shook his head. He wheeled a large ultrasound machine to the side of my bed and instructed the nurse to adjust my blankets. He applied a cold, clear gel to my lower abdomen and pressed the transponder against my skin. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy black and white image. He tapped a few buttons on the keyboard, and suddenly a rapid, rhythmic whooshing sound filled the quiet room. It sounded exactly like the frantic galloping of a tiny horse. I stared at the monitor in complete confusion. Dr. Arrington pointed to a small, pulsing mass in the center of the screen. "Congratulations, Miss Davenport," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly calm. "You fainted due to a slight drop in your blood pressure, which is entirely normal for your condition. You are exactly 10 weeks pregnant." The entire room seemed to freeze. The rhythmic galloping sound echoing from the machine felt like a severe physical blow to my chest. I stared at the screen, then at Dr. Arrington, and then at Dominic, whose eyes had widened in absolute stunned amazement. A heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air for several seconds before I finally found my voice. "No," I whispered, shaking my head frantically. "No, that is completely impossible. You are making a mistake. You have the wrong patient." Dr. Arrington frowned slightly, looking down at his tablet. "There is no mistake, I assure you. The ultrasound is completely definitive, and your blood panels confirm highly elevated hormone levels, indicative of early-stage pregnancy." I sat up in the bed, aggressively wiping the ultrasound gel off my stomach with a towel. "You do not understand," I insisted, my voice rising in panic and frustration. "I cannot get pregnant. I am completely sterile. I have severe, irreversible scarring on my ovaries. It is a documented medical fact. I have been treated for years by one of the top fertility specialists in Atlanta." Dominic placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off, reaching desperately for my purse, resting on the bedside table. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking violently as I accessed my secure digital medical portal. I pulled up the extensive files from Dr. Wallace, the Davenport family physician. I shoved the glowing screen directly into Dr. Arrington's hands. "Read it," I demanded. "Look at the biopsy results. Look at the internal scans from 2 years ago." Dr. Wallace explicitly stated that my fallopian tubes were entirely blocked and my ovaries were permanently compromised. He told me I had zero chance of ever conceiving a child naturally. Dr. Arrington adjusted his glasses and spent several long minutes scrolling through the digital records I had provided. His professional demeanor slowly cracked, replaced by a deep, troubled frown. He compared the files on my phone to the live data displaying on the ultrasound monitor beside my bed. This makes absolutely no sense, he muttered mostly to himself. The pathology reports in this Atlanta file describe a reproductive system that has been decimated by severe endometriosis and pelvic inflammatory disease. But looking at your ultrasound right now, I see absolutely zero evidence of any such trauma. I refuse to believe him. The psychological conditioning of the past 5 years had been utterly relentless. I had attended dozens of painful medical appointments, swallowed countless expensive experimental pills, and endured endless humiliating conversations with Vivian about my broken, useless body. I demanded that Dr. Arrington perform a full, comprehensive MRI and a completely new battery of internal scans immediately. I needed him to see the damage. I needed him to confirm the agonizing reality I had accepted as my permanent truth. Dominic quietly stepped out of the room to make the necessary administrative calls, ensuring the hospital staff expedited my exact requests without any bureaucratic delays. For the next 3 hours, I was pushed through various high-tech scanning machines poked with needles and subjected to incredibly thorough examinations by Dr. Arrington and a team of specialized gynecologists. I lay in the sterile imaging tubes, staring blankly at the ceiling, my mind racing with a chaotic mixture of terrifying hope and absolute dread. When I was finally wheeled back into my private suite, Dominic was pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. Dr. Arrington walked in shortly after carrying a thick manila folder containing the fresh high-resolution imaging results. He did not look confused anymore. He looked profoundly disturbed. He placed the heavy folder on my lap and opened it, revealing the pristine, detailed scans of my internal organs. "I have been practicing medicine for 30 years," Dr. Arrington began, his voice completely devoid of its former polite detachment. "I have reviewed your new scans alongside 3 other independent specialists in this hospital. Ms. Davenport, your reproductive system is absolutely flawless. There is no scarring. There is no blockage. Your ovaries are perfectly healthy, and your uterus is providing a highly optimal environment for your 10-week-old fetus." I stared blindly at the glossy images, my brain refusing to process his words. "But the files from Atlanta," I stammered. "Dr. Wallace showed me the images of the scarring himself." Dr. Arrington sighed heavily, pulling my phone from his pocket and placing it next to the real scans. "The files provided by your doctor in Atlanta are complete fabrications. The ultrasound images attached to your file belong to a completely different patient. The biopsy reports are entirely falsified. I do not know who this Dr. Wallace is, but he has committed massive, blatant medical fraud. He intentionally diagnosed you with a severe condition you never possessed, and he doctored your official medical records to perfectly support that lie." The realization hit me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. Dr. Wallace was not just some random physician. He was the prominent Davenport family doctor. He had attended Vivian exclusive dinner parties. He had played golf with Julian at the country club every single Sunday. He was on the direct payroll of the massive family fund. The entire agonizing narrative of my infertility, the years of soul-crushing guilt, the endless apologies I had tearfully whispered to Julian in the dark, the brutal $5 million divorce settlement. It was all a calculated, meticulously orchestrated lie. They had known. Vivian had known. Julian had known. They had literally paid a licensed medical professional to manipulate my charts and convince me that I was a broken, barren woman. Why? The question screamed through my mind until the horrific answer finally materialized. Julian, the golden child of the Davenport Empire, the man who desperately needed an heir to secure his inheritance and his massive ego. It was not me who was broken. It was him. Vivian had orchestrated this massive, cruel deception simply to protect her precious son from the social humiliation of being entirely sterile. She had decided to sacrifice my sanity, my marriage, and my entire self-worth just to maintain their flawless public image. I sat frozen on the hospital bed, my hands resting instinctively over my lower stomach, where Dominic Child was currently growing safely. The tears finally came, but they were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were hot, bitter tears of absolute, unadulterated rage. Dominic stepped forward and wrapped his strong arms around me, pulling my face against his chest as I trembled violently. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me to calm down. He simply held me, his own body tense with barely contained fury, as he realized the sheer magnitude of the evil I had been subjected to. The Davenports had stolen 5 years of my life. They had mentally tortured me and thrown me away like defective garbage. But sitting in that London hospital room listening to the impossible, beautiful heartbeat of my unborn child echoing from the monitor, I made a silent, deadly vow. I was going to completely annihilate them. Dominic immediately understood the dangerous shift in my demeanor. He did not offer empty words of comfort, because he knew I did not need them. He recognized the cold, calculating look in my eyes, because it was the exact same look he possessed when orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover. He simply pulled out his secure phone and made a single brief phone call. Within 48 hours, I was discharged from the hospital and sitting comfortably in my glass-walled Mayfair office, sliding a thick file across my desk to the most ruthless private investigator money could buy. His name was Silas, a former British intelligence operative who specialized in corporate espionage, offshore financial tracking, and unearthing the deeply buried secrets of the global elite. He did not ask questions about morality. He only asked for a target. I gave him Dr. Wallace. I wanted to know every single detail about the esteemed Davenport family physician. I wanted his bank records, his private emails, his offshore accounts, and the digital footprint of every transaction he had made over the last 5 years. I gave Silas a blank check funded by the very money Vivian had paid me to disappear. I told him to tear Dr. Wallace's life apart and find the exact price of my suffering. Silas went to work with terrifying efficiency. He completely bypassed standard legal channels, utilizing a network of high-level hackers and financial insiders to breach the heavily encrypted servers of Dr. Wallace's private medical practice in Atlanta. It only took Silas 2 weeks to return to my office with a sleek black hard drive containing the answers that would ultimately destroy the Davenport empire. We sat in the dimly lit boardroom of my firm, Dominic standing silently by the window, while Silas connected the drive to the projector. The first image that flashed onto the screen was a complex financial flowchart. Silas explained that Dr. Wallace lived a lifestyle far exceeding the standard income of a private family physician. He owned a massive vacation estate in the Hamptons, a brand-new luxury yacht moored in Miami, and a fleet of imported sports cars. None of these extravagant assets were registered in his actual name. They were hidden behind an intricate web of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. But Silas had meticulously followed the digital money trail, tracing the funds backward through a series of offshore accounts until he hit the absolute source. Silas clicked a button and a scanned bank document appeared on the massive screen. It was a wire transfer authorization. The amount was staggering, $750,000. The date on the transfer was exactly 1 week before Dr. Wallace had first called me into his office to deliver the devastating, fabricated news that my fallopian tubes were severely scarred and my ovaries were permanently compromised. And the signature at the bottom of the wire transfer authorization belonged to Vivian Davenport. The transaction was cleverly disguised as an anonymous charitable donation to a medical research foundation that Dr. Wallace secretly controlled. It was a massive, untraceable bribe. Vivian had literally purchased my medical diagnosis. But the financial corruption was only the beginning of the nightmare. Silas clicked to the next slide, bringing up a highly classified, heavily encrypted medical file that he had extracted from a hidden offline server in Dr. Wallace's basement. The name at the top of the file was Julian Davenport. Silas looked at me with a grim expression and explained that he had cross-referenced the dates. Julian had visited Dr. Wallace for a comprehensive fertility screening 6 months before my own invasive testing had even begun. I read the medical jargon glowing on the screen, my blood running completely cold. The official diagnosis was highlighted in bright yellow. Non-obstructive azoospermia. I stared at the words, the clinical terminology burning themselves into my memory. Julian's reproductive system was not just compromised, it was completely and utterly barren. The report detailed that his body produced absolutely zero sperm due to a severe, undocumented bout of complications from an infection he suffered during his early teenage years. The condition was entirely irreversible. There was no surgery, no experimental medication, and no amount of Davenport money that could ever fix it. Julian was genetically incapable of fathering a child. He was a complete biological dead end. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me in sickening waves. Everything suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Vivian had always known her golden son was defective. In the hyper-competitive, image-obsessed world of the Atlanta Black elite, a man's worth is often directly tied to his ability to produce heirs. In their powerful mega-church circles, family lineage was worshipped right alongside God. The Davenport name was a brand, a symbol of unmatched strength, virility, and generational dominance. Julian was the chief executive officer of the family fund, a prominent member of his prestigious fraternity, and the supposed alpha male of their social hierarchy. If the high society gossips ever discovered that the Prince of Atlanta was completely sterile, it would have shattered his fragile masculine ego and severely damaged the pristine, powerful image Vivian had spent decades cultivating. Vivian could not allow her son to be viewed as inadequate or flawed. She needed a scapegoat to carry the immense burden of his biological failure. And I was the perfect expendable target. I was the outsider. I was the woman who did not come from old money, who worked for a living, and who had never fully submitted to Vivian controlling demands. I sat in my luxurious London office, gripping the edge of the mahogany table as a tidal wave of suppressed memories flooded my mind. I remembered sitting in the sterile examination room, trembling with fear, while Dr. Wallace showed me the forged ultrasound images of my supposedly ruined reproductive organs. I remembered the heavy, crushing guilt I felt every time I looked at Julian, genuinely believing that my broken body was denying him the family he desperately wanted. I remembered the endless bottles of expensive fertility pills Dr. Wallace had prescribed me. I realized with a wave of absolute horror that I had spent 2 years swallowing unknown chemical compounds, likely nothing more than high-dose vitamins or unregulated hormones designed to mimic the side effects of real fertility treatments just to keep up the elaborate illusion. They had actively poisoned my mind and manipulated my body. They had watched me cry myself to sleep night after night, begging God to fix my broken womb, while they secretly knew I was completely healthy. Julian had held me in his arms, whispering that we would overcome my infertility together, fully aware that he was the one shooting blanks. He was not just a coward. He was a deeply sinister, pathological liar who was willing to sacrifice my sanity to protect his own pathetic pride. And then there was Vanessa, the young, beautiful, light-skinned mistress who was currently parading around Atlanta with a heavily pregnant belly. If Julian was 100% sterile, then the twin boys Vanessa was carrying absolutely did not belong to him. I looked up at Silas, my mind racing through the dark, twisted implications of this massive revelation. "Do we know who the real father of Vanessa babies is?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Silas shook his head slightly. "Not definitively yet. Vanessa has been incredibly careful with her communications. However, my surveillance team in Atlanta has noted that she spends a highly unusual amount of time alone with Julian's younger brother, Darius. They frequent the same private VIP rooms at exclusive clubs when Julian is traveling for business. But without a direct DNA test, it remains circumstantial. It did not matter. The identity of the real father was just the explosive detonator waiting to be pressed. The primary weapon was already locked and loaded in my hands. I had the undeniable concrete proof of their massive medical fraud. I had the wire transfers. I had Julian's real medical file. I had everything I needed to burn the Davenport legacy to the absolute ground. Dominic walked over and placed his hands firmly on my shoulders, grounding me in the present moment. "You have the truth now, Nia," he said softly, his voice vibrating with a dangerous protective energy. "What do you want to do with it?" I looked at the glowing screen, staring at the financial records of the people who had tried to destroy me. They had paid me $5 million to disappear quietly, assuming I would fade into pathetic obscurity. They thought they had successfully buried their dirty secrets under a mountain of hush money and high society influence. They thought they had secured their perfect, untouchable future with a fake pregnancy and a stolen empire. I reached out and closed the laptop, plunging the boardroom into a quiet, heavy darkness. I did not want to just expose them. Exposure was too quick, too merciful. I wanted them to build their fraudulent castle as high as possible. I wanted Vivian to brag to every single woman in her church. I wanted Julian to stand proudly in front of his wealthy investors and boast about his unborn sons. I wanted them to invest every single ounce of their pride, their money, and their reputation into this massive lie. And then when they were standing at the absolute pinnacle of their false glory, I was going to rip the foundation right out from under them and watch them plummet into total ruin. I am going to let them have their babies, I told Dominic, turning to meet his intense gaze. I am going to let them host their extravagant baby showers and finalize their ridiculous society wedding. And while they are distracted by their fake family, we are going to quietly buy up the massive debt of the Davenport Family Fund. We are going to bleed their empire dry from the inside out. Dominic smiled, a predatory, brilliant expression that perfectly matched the darkness blooming inside my own chest. A hostile financial takeover, he agreed smoothly. Funded by their own severance package. It is absolute poetry. I stood up from the table, feeling the protective warmth of my own true pregnancy blossoming within me. The Davenports had tried to convince me that my womb was a barren wasteland, but instead it was carrying the heir to a completely different, infinitely more powerful dynasty. The game had officially changed. The hunted had just become the architect of their ultimate destruction. 8 months had passed since that revelation in the London clinic. While Dominic and I were quietly consolidating our financial stronghold over the Davenport Empire from the shadows of our European headquarters, the glittering illusion Vivian had so desperately constructed in Atlanta was beginning to fracture under its own immense weight. The Davenports had gotten exactly what they wanted. Julian and Vanessa had been married in a spectacularly lavish ceremony at the largest mega church in the city, complete with a 6-tier cake, a celebrity guest list, and a massive spread in a prominent high society magazine. 3 months after the wedding, Vanessa delivered the highly anticipated heirs to the Davenport dynasty. 2 baby boys named Julian Jr. and Kingston. From the outside looking in, they were the absolute picture of generational Black wealth and perfection. But inside the cold, cavernous walls of the Davenport estate, a deeply toxic environment was rapidly boiling over. The first major red flag was glaringly obvious to anyone who dared to look closely. The twins did not look a single thing like Julian. Julian possessed the striking deep mahogany skin and sharp angular jawline that had defined the men of the Davenport lineage for 3 generations. The twins, however, were exceptionally fair, with a very specific, soft bone structure and hazel eyes that completely bypassed Julian genetics. Of course, babies often favor one parent over the other, and Vanessa was light-skinned. But as the months went by, the infants began to display distinct facial expressions, hair textures, and physical mannerisms that were entirely foreign to Julian. They did, however, bear an uncanny, terrifying resemblance to his younger brother, Darius. Darius had always been the black sheep of the family, known for his hazel eyes, his lighter complexion inherited from a distant grandfather, and his completely irresponsible lifestyle. Every time Darius visited the estate to see his new nephews, an uncomfortable, suffocating tension filled the room. Julian would stand in the corner, nursing a glass of scotch, watching Darius hold the babies with a sickening sense of intuition gnawing at his gut. But Vivian aggressively forced the narrative. She was a master of psychological manipulation, and she deployed her skills with terrifying efficiency. Whenever a wealthy church friend or a nosy country club associate came over to visit the nursery and made even the slightest comment about the babies looking a bit different than expected, Vivian would immediately shut them down. She would loudly declare that young Kingston had Julian exact nose, or that Julian Jr. possessed his father exact temperament. She filled the mansion with massive custom-painted portraits of Julian holding the boys, literally papering over the obvious physical discrepancies with sheer financial force. She paid off the estate staff with massive bonuses, ensuring their absolute silence regarding the obvious tension in the household. Vivian was determined to maintain the perfect facade, completely blind to the fact that she had invited a ruthless predator directly into her home. Vanessa had completely dropped her innocent sweet girl act the absolute second the ink was dry on their marriage certificate and the babies were safely delivered. She was no longer the grateful, accommodating young woman who had tearfully begged me to step aside. She had secured her position as the mother of the Davenport heirs, and she was going to extract every single ounce of power that title afforded her. The dynamic inside the mansion shifted violently. Vanessa realized very quickly that Julian was entirely dependent on her to maintain his fragile masculine image, and she used that leverage to become a tyrant. She began making outrageous financial demands, completely bypassing Julian and going straight to the board of the family fund. She demanded a 20% ownership stake in the company, citing her need to secure a financial future for the boys. When Julian weakly tried to protest, arguing that the fund was meant to stay strictly within the bloodline, Vanessa simply smiled a cruel, knowing smile and threatened to pack up the twins and leave him for a highly publicized divorce. Julian, terrified of the public humiliation that would follow losing another wife so quickly, completely folded and gave her the shares. Vanessa's cruelty was not just limited to Julian. She aimed her most venomous behavior directly at Vivian. The matriarch who had once ruled the Atlanta high society scene with an iron fist was now being treated like a glorified servant in her own home. Vanessa would intentionally schedule her massive, obnoxious charity luncheons at the estate and order Vivian to manage the catering staff. If the floral arrangements were slightly incorrect, Vanessa would publicly berate Vivian in front of the other society women, heavily implying that the older woman was losing her touch. Vivian, paralyzed by her desperate need to keep the babies in the house and the family secret hidden, swallowed her massive pride and took the abuse. She watched with simmering, silent rage as Vanessa completely redecorated the historic estate, throwing out expensive family heirlooms and replacing them with gaudy modern furniture. She fired the loyal household staff who had worked for the family for decades, replacing them with a private entourage of stylists and personal assistants who catered exclusively to her every whim. The grand dining room where I had once been handed my divorce papers was transformed into her personal staging area for endless influencer photo shoots. Vanessa was systematically erasing the Davenport legacy and replacing it with a monument to her own vanity and greed. Julian was rapidly deteriorating under the immense pressure of his miserable reality. He had traded a loyal, self-sufficient wife for a demanding tyrant, all to secure a biological legacy that his own subconscious was begging him to question. He spent most of his time locked in his home office or taking extended business trips just to avoid the chaotic, hostile environment of his own house. He was drinking heavily popping anxiety medication just to make it through his board meetings and aggressively dodging phone calls from investors who were beginning to notice his erratic behavior. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making, desperately clinging to the false hope that the twins would eventually grow to look like him and silence the deafening doubts in his mind. The fragile, miserable universe they had constructed was about to be violently shattered by a completely unforeseen biological crisis. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 8 months after the twins were born. The mansion was relatively calm. Vanessa was upstairs getting a private massage, and Julian was in his study reviewing financial documents. The silence was suddenly broken by a frantic, piercing scream from the nursery. Julian rushed down the hallway, bursting through the door, to find the night nurse hovering over little Kingston crib in absolute panic. The baby was completely limp, his skin carrying a terrifying grayish-blue tint. His breathing was incredibly shallow, and his tiny chest was barely moving. Julian scooped the infant into his arms, his heart hammering against his ribs in sheer terror. He yelled for Vivian to call an ambulance, entirely ignoring Vanessa, who had come running out of her room in a silk robe, demanding to know what was ruining her evening. The ride to the hospital was a chaotic blur of screaming sirens and agonizing panic. They arrived at the elite pediatric wing of the Atlanta Medical Center. Within an hour, word had spread through their elite social circles. Several prominent members of Vivian Mega Church, board the very people whose approval she valued above her own soul, arrived at the hospital to offer their prayers and support. They sat in the plush waiting area, whispering among themselves while watching the family fall apart. Julian paced the waiting room for 3 grueling hours, His expensive suit wrinkled, his hands shaking violently as he drank terrible hospital coffee. Vivian sat rigidly in a plastic chair, quietly reciting church prayers, while Vanessa paced the floor, complaining loudly about how the stress was ruining her complexion. The sheer difference in their reactions was sickening, but Julian was too terrified for the baby to even notice his wife's horrific lack of maternal instinct. Finally, a pediatric hematologist named Dr. Evans emerged from the double doors of the intensive care unit. His face was grim, heavily lined with exhaustion. Julian rushed forward, demanding to know what was wrong with his son. Dr. Evans explained that Kingston had suffered a severe sudden hemolytic crisis. The infant red blood cells were rapidly breaking down, depriving his vital organs of oxygen. The condition was caused by an extremely rare, highly specific hereditary blood disorder that had managed to bypass their initial newborn screenings. The baby bone marrow was failing to produce enough healthy cells to replace the ones being destroyed. Kingston was in critical condition, and his tiny body was rapidly going into shock. He needed an immediate, massive blood transfusion to stabilize his system and save his life. Julian did not hesitate for a single second. He aggressively rolled up the sleeve of his dress shirt and extended his arm toward the doctor. "Take my blood," he demanded, his voice cracking with desperate emotion. "I am his father. Take whatever he needs. Just save my son." Dr. Evans looked at Julian, his professional demeanor remaining entirely calm despite the frantic energy in the room. "We are currently running the boy blood panels through the lab to determine his exact type and screen for the specific genetic markers of this disorder," Dr. Evans explained slowly. "Given the extreme rarity of this specific hereditary condition, a direct paternal match is often the absolute safest and most effective route for the initial emergency transfusion, especially to avoid shocking his already fragile immune system. We will draw your blood immediately, Mr. Davenport, and rush it to the lab for a rapid cross-match." Vivian stood up, her face completely drained of color. She looked at Vanessa, who had suddenly stopped pacing and was staring at the doctor with wide, terrified eyes. The matriarch's hands began to tremble violently. She knew the absolute, undeniable truth about her son's sterility. She knew that Julian blood would never, under any circumstances, match the infant fighting for his life in the next room. But she was completely trapped. She could not stop the doctor from drawing Julian blood without screaming her massive, fraudulent secret to the entire hospital wing full of her church friends. She could not invent a medical excuse fast enough to stop the impending disaster. Her perfectly constructed house of cards was finally catching fire, and there was absolutely no escape from the flames. Julian was quickly ushered into an adjacent medical room, entirely focused on saving the child he fiercely believed was his own flesh and blood. He sat in the cold leather chair, watching the nurse insert the thick needle into his vein, feeling a profound sense of paternal duty wash over him. He was willing to bleed himself dry for his legacy. He was completely unaware that the vial of dark red blood traveling rapidly down the hospital corridor was not going to save his family. It was the exact chemical weapon that was going to permanently destroy it. The results of that rapid cross-match would not just expose a simple medical incompatibility. It would completely detonate the $5 million lie they had used to banish me from Atlanta, and the devastating fallout was going to be absolutely spectacular. And while Julian sat there bleeding for a ghost, I was sitting comfortably in London, feeling the real Davenport air kicking strongly against my ribs, waiting patiently for the inevitable explosion. Julian sat in the sterile extraction room, watching the thick, dark red liquid fill the plastic bag, feeling an overwhelming sense of self-righteous pride. He genuinely believed he was performing the ultimate act of patriarchal duty. He was the protector of the Davenport bloodline. When the nurse finally taped a cotton ball to his inner elbow, he rolled down his expensive tailored sleeve and walked back into the main waiting area with the exhausted swagger of a conquering hero. The waiting room had grown surprisingly crowded over the past hour. The Atlanta elite operated on a highly efficient gossip network, and several more influential members of the church congregation had arrived, dressed in their Sunday best, despite it being a Tuesday evening. They brought useless casseroles and hollow prayers, their eyes gleaming with morbid curiosity. Vivian was holding court in the center of the room, playing the role of the tragically strong matriarch. She was aggressively performing for her audience, dabbing her completely dry eyes with a silk handkerchief while reciting scripture. Vanessa sat rigidly in the corner, her face pale, chewing her manicured thumbnails down to the quick. She was not praying for Kingston to survive. She was praying that the hospital lab equipment would miraculously malfunction. The heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open, cutting through the low murmur of the crowded room. Dr. Evans stepped out holding a thick medical chart. The exhausted, sympathetic expression he had worn earlier was entirely gone, replaced by a look of deep professional confusion. Julian stepped forward immediately, his chest puffed out, expecting to be praised for his rapid sacrifice. "Tell me you gave him my blood," Julian demanded loudly, ensuring his audience could hear his masculine authority. "Tell me my son is going to be all right." Dr. Evans did not smile. He did not offer any reassuring platitudes. He looked down at the medical chart, then back up at Julian, heavily aware of the massive audience watching their interaction. "Mr. Davenport." Dr. Evans began, his voice tight and careful. "We have stabilized Kingston using emergency O, positive donor blood from our hospital reserves. He is currently resting and responding well to the treatment." Julian let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, turning back to look at the congregation members with a triumphant smile. "Then why did you not use my blood?" Julian asked, turning back to the doctor. "I am his father. I wanted him to have my blood." The waiting room fell completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. Dr. Evans adjusted his glasses, looking extremely uncomfortable. "Sir, I cannot use your blood for the transfusion because it would trigger a fatal immune response. Your rapid cross-match results just came back from the laboratory. Mr. Davenport, you are a B negative." Julian blinked, clearly not comprehending the medical terminology. "Okay, so what? Just give it to him. He is my son." Dr. Evans let out a heavy breath, lowering the clipboard. "Sir, it is a fundamental rule of genetics. A man with an AB negative blood type cannot possibly father a child with an O positive blood type. It is biologically, scientifically impossible. The baby lacks both the A and B antigens that you would have absolutely passed down." Julian froze. The triumphant smile completely melted off his face, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. The words hung in the sterile hospital air, echoing loudly in the deafening silence. "What are you talking about?" Julian asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small. "You are mistaken," Vivian interrupted sharply. She practically shoved her way through the crowd of church members, her face flushed with absolute panic. She grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "The doctor is just exhausted, Julian. He is reading the wrong chart. Let us go into a private room and discuss this quietly." She was desperate to drag him away from the audience, desperate to contain the explosive secret before it completely detonated. But Julian ripped his arm away from his mother grip. He stepped closer to Dr. Evans, his physical posture turning highly aggressive. "Are you calling my wife a liar?" Julian shouted, his voice echoing violently down the hospital corridor. "Are you standing here, in front of my family and my community, and telling me that my son is not mine?" Dr. Evans did not back down. He was a medical professional, not a country club socialite, and he did not care about the Davenport family legacy. "I am not making any accusations, Mr. Davenport. I am simply reading the laboratory results. You are not the biological father of that child." A loud collective gasp erupted from the church members. Several women clutched their pearls, their eyes darting wildly between Julian the doctor and Vanessa. Vanessa had completely shrunk into her plastic chair, her face buried in her hands, refusing to look up. Julian turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto his wife. The sheer denial in his brain was fighting a massive, losing battle against the mounting evidence. He refused to look like a fool. He refused to let these people believe that the Prince of Atlanta had been cuckolded. "Fix this," Julian screamed at the doctor, pointing a shaking finger directly at his face. "Run the test again. Your lab technicians are completely incompetent. Run a full DNA test right now. I demand an emergency paternity test this absolute second." Dr. Evans sighed, clearly irritated by the outburst, but willing to comply to de-escalate the situation. We can expedite a cheek swab paternity test through our rapid genetics lab, but it will take a few hours to process. Do it, Julian roared, slamming his fist against the reception desk. Do it right now, and I want everyone in this room to stay exactly where they are until the results come back to prove this idiot wrong. What followed was the most excruciating, humiliating 3 hours in the history of the Davenport family. No one left the waiting room. The church members, absolutely thrilled by the unfolding scandal, sat glued to their seats, aggressively texting their friends and family members. The rumors were already spreading like wildfire across the city before the test was even administered. The hospital staff quickly swabbed Julian's cheek and took a sample from the baby in the intensive care unit. Then the waiting began. Julian paced the length of the room like a rabid dog, completely ignoring Vanessa, who was silently weeping in the corner. Vivian sat frozen, her posture rigid, staring straight ahead at the blank wall. She knew exactly what the results would be. She knew that her massive, cruel deception was finally crumbling into dust, and there was absolutely no amount of money in her bank account that could buy her way out of this nightmare. She had sacrificed my life to protect her son Pride, and now she was being forced to watch that same Pride get publicly slaughtered in a hospital waiting room. Shortly after midnight, the heavy double doors swung open one final time. Dr. Evans walked out carrying a single piece of paper. The entire waiting room instantly went dead silent. Even the weeping from Vanessa completely stopped. Julian stopped pacing and stood frozen in the center of the room, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his forehead. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, desperately waiting for a pardon that was never going to come. "Give it to me," Julian demanded, holding out a violently shaking hand. Dr. Evans did not hand him the paper. He looked at Julian with a mixture of profound pity and professional detachment. "I am sorry, Mr. Davenport. The rapid DNA results are conclusive. The probability of paternity is 0%. You are not the father." The explosion of whispers was instantaneous and deafening. 0%. The words hit Julian like a physical blow to the stomach. He staggered backward, knocking over a plastic chair. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had just willingly bled for a child that belonged to another man. His entire identity, his perceived masculinity, his unquestioned dominance in the family hierarchy, all of it instantly vaporized. He looked at the crowd of people staring at him. He saw the pity in their eyes. He saw the suppressed amusement. He saw the absolute destruction of his flawless social image. Julian let out a guttural, agonizing scream that tore through the hospital lobby, a sound of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had spent his entire life mocking weakness, looking down on outsiders like me, completely convinced of his own genetic superiority. Now he was the ultimate punchline. The wealthy, arrogant CEO, who had paid his wife $5 million to leave so he could raise another man, bastard children. The public execution of Julian Davenport ego was completely finalized. And the absolute worst part of his nightmare was only just beginning, because the identity of the real father was still sitting comfortably inside the Davenport mansion, completely unaware that the explosive truth was about to walk right through the front door. The drive back to the Davenport estate was conducted in a suffocating, terrifying silence. Julian gripped the steering wheel of his Mercedes so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the dark Atlanta roads. He drove recklessly, completely ignoring speed limits and traffic signals, fueled entirely by the explosive rage coursing through his veins. In the passenger seat, Vanessa sat curled into a tight ball, trembling violently, her face pressed against the cold glass of the window. She was sobbing quietly, a pathetic, high-pitched sound that only seemed to fuel the absolute fury radiating from her husband. In the back seat, Vivian sat rigid and silent, her mind racing desperately to find a way out of the collapsing labyrinth she had built. But there was no escape. The hospital had drawn the blood. The laboratory had processed the DNA. The absolute undeniable truth was now a documented medical fact. Julian was not the father of those twin boys, and he was currently locked in a metal box with the woman who had humiliated him in front of his entire elite community. When the car finally screeched to a violent halt in the circular driveway of the mansion, Julian did not bother turning off the engine. He unbuckled his seatbelt, threw open his door, and marched around the front of the vehicle. He grabbed Vanessa by her upper arm, hauling her roughly out of the passenger seat. She stumbled in her expensive designer heels, crying out in pain, but Julian ignored her. He dragged her up the wide marble steps of the estate, kicking the heavy mahogany front doors open with such force that they crashed loudly against the interior walls. The few remaining staff members who were working the night shift immediately scattered, terrified by the chaotic violence erupting in the grand foyer. Julian shoved Vanessa into the center of the massive living room. She fell onto the plush Persian rug, weeping hysterically, her perfect hair disheveled and her expensive silk dress ruined. Julian stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a manic, dangerous energy. He looked like a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. For 5 years, he had treated me like a defective piece of property, entirely convinced of his own genetic perfection. Now the absolute certainty of his manhood had been ripped away, leaving behind a raw, bleeding wound of insecurity and rage. "Who is it?" Julian roared, his voice echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings. "Who did you sleep with?" Vanessa covered her face with her trembling hands, shaking her head frantically. "Julian, please," she sobbed. "Please, you have to listen to me. I did not want to do it. I swear to God, I did not want to." Julian grabbed a priceless crystal vase from a nearby side table and hurled it violently against the stone fireplace. It shattered into thousands of jagged pieces, causing Vanessa to scream and flinch backward. "Stop lying to me," he bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "You played the innocent victim. You cried in my dining room and told my ex-wife that we were so deeply in love. You told me those boys were my legacy. Now look me in the eyes and tell me the name of the man who gave you those children. Tell me who you spread your legs for while you were spending my money and living in my house." Vivian finally walked through the front doors, her face pale, her breathing shallow. She stepped into the living room, trying to project her usual aura of commanding authority, but her hands were shaking visibly. "Julian, that is enough," she ordered, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "You are out of control. We will handle this discreetly in the morning. We need to consult with our lawyers before anyone says something they will regret." Julian whipped around to face his mother, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Discreetly, he screamed. "You want to handle this discreetly? Half of your church congregation was sitting in that hospital waiting room, Mother. They heard the doctor. They saw the DNA results. The entire city of Atlanta knows I am a joke. There is no discretion left." He turned his attention back to Vanessa, taking a threatening step toward her. "I am going to ask you one last time," he growled, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "Give me the name, or I swear I will throw you out into the street tonight, with nothing but the clothes on your back, and I will make sure you never see a single dime of Davenport money again." Vanessa looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She was cornered. She knew Julian was entirely capable of destroying her life, and her survival instincts immediately kicked in. She desperately needed a shield, someone else to take the blame for her betrayal. She frantically scanned the room, her eyes darting toward the grand staircase, then toward the hallway leading to the back of the estate. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors of the library swung open. Darius walked out, holding a half-empty glass of expensive bourbon. He was wearing silk pajamas, completely oblivious to the catastrophic events that had transpired at the hospital over the last 3 hours. He had spent the evening drinking and ignoring the frantic phone calls from the estate staff. He froze when he saw the shattered crystal on the floor, Vanessa weeping on the rug, and his older brother standing over her like a vengeful god. Darius immediately sensed the explosive danger in the room. He took one look at Julian, faced slowly, took a step backward, and turned toward the back door, fully intending to sneak out into the gardens and avoid the conflict entirely. Vanessa saw him. Her eyes widened and she pointed a shaking finger directly at the younger Davenport brother. "It is him," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperate hysteria. "It is Darius. He is the father." The absolute silence that followed her declaration was deafening. The air in the room became so incredibly thick and tense it was difficult to breathe. Darius stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders stiffening. He slowly turned around, his face completely drained of color. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes wide with sheer panic, silently begging her to shut her mouth. But the damage was already done. The words had been spoken and they hung in the air like a lethal poison. Julian slowly turned his head to look at his younger brother. His mind was violently connecting the pieces of the puzzle he had previously refused to see. The hazel eyes, the lighter complexion, the constant uncomfortable tension whenever Darius held the baby boys. The late nights Vanessa had spent at the same VIP clubs his brother frequented. It all made perfect sickening sense. His own brother. His lazy, irresponsible party boy younger brother had slept with his wife and fathered the children he had proudly claimed as his own. "You bastard!" Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it shook his entire body. Julian charged across the living room with the speed and ferocity of a wild animal. He tackled Darius to the floor, sending the glass of bourbon flying against the wall. The two brothers crashed violently into a heavy wooden console table, knocking over expensive lamps and framed family photographs. Julian pinned Darius to the hardwood floor, pulling his fist back and driving it repeatedly into his brother's face. He hit him with 5 years of suppressed insecurity, the utter humiliation of the hospital waiting room, and the devastating realization of his own biological failure. Darius tried to fight back, raising his arms to shield his face, but he was completely overpowered by Julian's manic adrenaline-fueled strength. Vivienne screamed, rushing forward and grabbing Julian's shoulder desperately, trying to pull him off his brother. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her perfect composure entirely shattered. "You are going to kill him. Julian, get off of him right now." Julian ignored her, drawing his fist back for another brutal punch. But before he could strike, Vanessa scrambled to her feet. She ran toward the fighting brothers, her voice cutting through the chaotic violence like a sharp blade. "Don't touch him!" Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs. "Stop hitting him, Julian. It was not his fault. Your mother made us do it." Julian's fist froze in midair. He remained kneeling over his bleeding brother, his chest heaving, his entire body rigid. He slowly turned his head to look at Vanessa. The sheer confusion in his eyes was almost pitiful to witness. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vanessa stood in the center of the ruined living room, tears streaming down her face, pointing directly at Vivienne. "I said she made us do it!" Vanessa cried, her voice trembling, but gaining strength as she finally unleashed the massive toxic secret. "Your mother came to me months before we even got married. She knew you were completely sterile, Julian. She knew you could never give her the heirs she desperately wanted for this family. She told me that if I wanted to marry you, if I wanted to secure my place in this dynasty, I had to provide you with children that carried the Davenport bloodline. She orchestrated the entire thing. She paid for the private hotel rooms. She forced Darius to sleep with me. She told us it was the only way to protect your ego and save the family reputation. She paid your ex-wife $5 million to leave so you would never find out you were the one who was broken." Julian slowly stood up, backing away from his bleeding brother on the floor. He turned his gaze toward his mother. Vivienne stood frozen, her face completely ashen, her eyes wide with terror. The powerful, commanding matriarch, who had dictated the social rules of the Atlanta elite for decades, suddenly looked incredibly small, fragile, and pathetic. Julian stared at the woman who had birthed him, the woman who had controlled every aspect of his entire life, the woman who had engineered his massive public destruction just to save face at her country club. He did not yell. He did not throw anything else. The violent rage that had consumed him moments ago was entirely replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of the lie. His mother had not just manipulated his marriage. She had fundamentally destroyed his entire grasp on reality. She had literally orchestrated the conception of his nephews inside the womb of his own wife, all while patting him on the back and calling him a king. The absolute, staggering cruelty of her actions broke something deep inside his mind, completely, severing the strings she had used to control her golden child for his entire life. He looked around the destroyed living room, observing the shattered crystal. His bruised and bleeding brother, his weeping, treacherous wife, and his silent, manipulative mother. The Grand Davenport estate, once a symbol of unmatched power and elite status, had been reduced to a pathetic, broken circus of lies and absolute depravity. Julian slowly walked toward the front door, leaving his fraudulent family completely paralyzed in their own toxic wasteland. He stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open behind him. He had absolutely nothing left. His pride, his marriage, his legacy, and his sanity were completely annihilated. The explosion I had patiently waited for in London had finally detonated in Atlanta, and the devastating fallout was going to permanently erase the Davenport name from the highest echelons of society forever. Julian stood on the threshold of the grand estate, the cool night air washing over his face. He had intended to walk away to leave the toxic wasteland of his family behind and disappear into the dark. But as he stood there, the absolute silence of the driveway was broken by a sound that snapped the final remaining thread of his sanity. From inside the ruined living room, Darius let out a pathetic, cowardly whimper, attempting to apologize to Vivian for getting caught. That single sound of weakness ignited a completely blinding rage inside Julian. He did not walk away. He pivoted on his heel and charged back through the open mahogany doors with the unstoppable force of a derailed freight train. Darius barely had time to look up from the floor before Julian launched himself over the expensive velvet sofa. The physical brawl that immediately ensued was not a calculated fight between two wealthy executives. It was a chaotic, bloody display of absolute primal violence. Julian tackled his brother around the waist, driving them both backward. They crashed violently through the massive glass coffee table, sending thousands of lethal shards scattering across the antique Persian rug. Julian grabbed Darius by the lapels of his silk pajamas, slamming his younger brother head repeatedly against the solid hardwood floor. He was not just hitting Darius. He was trying to physically destroy the man who had stolen his wife, humiliated his name, and fathered the children he had proudly claimed as his own legacy. Darius fought back purely out of a desperate need to survive. He swung wildly, his fist connecting heavily with Julian's jaw, producing a sickening crack that echoed through the room. They rolled violently across the floor, tearing through the carefully curated displays of Davenport wealth. The antique porcelain vases Vivian had imported from Italy were smashed into worthless dust. The custom-framed oil portraits of the fake Davenport family were ripped from the walls and trampled under their bleeding hands. Blood smeared across the pristine white walls and soaked into the expensive upholstery. The pristine image of the family was being physically torn to shreds right in front of them. Vivian stood in the absolute center of the wreckage, shrieking for them to stop. Her voice was completely hoarse, stripped of all its usual commanding authority. She grabbed her signature pearl necklace, pulling it in her panic until the heavy silk string snapped. Dozens of expensive white pearls bounced across the bloody floor, a perfect physical representation of her massive social empire scattering into nothing. She reached down to grab Julian's shoulder, but he violently shoved her backward without even looking. She stumbled and fell hard onto the ruined sofa, screaming for the estate security guards, who had already fled the property in terror. Vanessa cowered behind a massive marble pillar, clutching her silk robe tightly around her trembling body. She was too terrified to intervene, but her selfish survival instincts remained incredibly sharp. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and began silently recording the brutal fight. She knew her marriage was entirely over, and she was already collecting video evidence of Julian's violent instability to hand directly to her divorce lawyers. She watched her husband and his brother beat each other bloody, feeling absolutely no remorse for the catastrophic damage her lies had caused. The deafening noise of shattering glass and screaming voices echoed loudly across the manicured lawns of the wealthy Buckhead neighborhood. It did not take long for the private security patrol to alert the local authorities. Within 10 minutes, the blinding red and blue lights of 4 Atlanta police cruisers illuminated the circular driveway. Officers stormed the mansion with their weapons drawn, shouting aggressive commands that completely drowned out Vivian's frantic excuses. They found the prominent chief executive officer of the Davenport Fund and his vice president brother covered in blood, panting heavily on the ruined floor, completely surrounded by the shattered remnants of their fraudulent lives. The police officers did not care about their elite social status. They did not care about the size of their massive bank accounts or their influence at the local country club. They aggressively flipped Julian onto his stomach, driving a knee into his back as they secured the heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. Darius was dragged up from the floor, his face severely bruised and bleeding from a deep cut above his eye. The officers marched both men out of the front doors in full view of the wealthy neighbors who had stepped out onto their sprawling porches in expensive robes to watch the spectacular, unprecedented downfall. Vivian chased after the officers down the marble steps, frantically waving her arms and offering to write a massive check to make the arrest disappear. She demanded that they release her sons immediately, threatening to call the police commissioner who regularly attended her church. The commanding officer firmly pushed her back behind the yellow police tape, warning her that she would be arrested for obstruction if she took another step. The humiliation was absolute and entirely unavoidable. Julian was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, his face pressed against the cold glass, forced to watch his mother weeping on the lawn as the car pulled away into the dark. By 5 o'clock the next morning, the pristine Davenport image was completely eviscerated. An anonymous source at the downtown police precinct, likely a desk clerk who recognized the wealthy brothers, leaked the booking photos directly to the media. The mugshots were absolutely devastating. Julian looked feral, his expensive designer suit torn and heavily stained with dark blood, his left eye completely swollen shut. Darius looked like a terrified, beaten child. The images were immediately picked up and posted by the Shade Room. The anonymous source had also leaked the entire story. The devastating caption detailed the humiliating hospital fiasco, the catastrophic DNA results, the brotherly betrayal, and the brutal fistfight at the estate. The post garnered over 1 million comments in under a single hour. The Atlanta Black elite, the exact people Vivian had sacrificed my entire life to impress, were brutally mocking them across every single social media platform. The internet was completely merciless. Prominent members of Vivian megachurch congregation, people who had smiled in her face just yesterday, were sharing the post with fake prayers and thinly veiled malicious glee. Twitter erupted with trending hashtags mocking the Davenport legacy. The massive toxic secret was officially out in the open, and the general public was eagerly feasting on their absolute ruin. The social humiliation was deeply agonizing for the family, but the financial devastation that immediately followed was entirely lethal. The Davenport Fund was not just a regular corporate investment firm. Its massive success was heavily built on the specific concept of generational trust, strict Christian values, and community leadership. Their biggest clients were massive megachurches, conservative pension funds, and wealthy legacy families who demanded absolute moral perfection from the people managing their money. When the sun rose over Atlanta, those powerful investors woke up to the viral mugshots and the disgusting, highly publicized details of the family scandal. The reaction was instantaneous and completely unforgiving. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the phone lines at the Davenport corporate headquarters were ringing constantly. Major clients were frantically calling their account managers, demanding immediate full withdrawals of their investments. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting before the market even opened, aggressively locking Julian out of the corporate servers while he was still sitting in a holding cell trying to arrange his bail. The fund was heavily leveraged in long-term commercial real estate projects and complex illiquid assets. They simply did not possess the cash reserves to facilitate the massive sudden wave of panic withdrawal requests. The company was instantly thrown into a severe terminal liquidity crisis. When the news of the panicked investors leaked to the financial press, the company stock plummeted 40% in a single afternoon. Vivian sat in her ruined living room, desperately calling her wealthy church friends and prominent board members, begging for short-term loans to stabilize the bleeding firm. Every single call went straight to voicemail. She was officially radioactive. Nobody in the elite circles wanted to be associated with a family that had orchestrated such a sickening, twisted deception. The empire they had meticulously built over 3 generations was burning to the absolute ground in less than 24 hours. Thousands of miles away in London, I sat comfortably in my sleek office sipping a cup of herbal tea while Dominic stood behind my chair, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. We watched the massive monitors on my wall tracking the global markets. We watched the Davenport stock completely crash in real time. The red numbers flashed brightly across the screen, signaling the exact moment their legacy officially died. The $5 million they had paid me to disappear had been carefully positioned by Dominic Firm over the last 8 months, heavily shorting the Davenport stock and strategically buying up their massive debt for pennies on the dollar. We were not just watching them bleed out. We were holding the only financial tourniquet in existence, and I had absolutely no intention of applying it. The brothers had fought the physical war, but the true conquest belonged entirely to me. I would later learn the precise, agonizing details of how Vanessa executed her final lethal maneuver against the Davenport family. While Julian was sitting in a holding cell waiting for his overworked corporate attorneys to arrange his bail, Vanessa did not waste a single second playing the role of a grieving, supportive wife. She knew the Golden Empire was collapsing, and she intended to carve out her massive piece of the wreckage before the entire ship sank. She immediately contacted the most ruthless, expensive divorce lawyer in Atlanta. This was a man notorious for utterly destroying wealthy husbands and liquidating their highly protected assets with terrifying efficiency. Vanessa walked into his high-rise corner office the very next morning, wearing large, dark designer sunglasses and carrying a pristine copy of the ironclad prenuptial agreement Vivian had forced her to sign. Vivian had originally designed that legal contract to completely protect Julian, but her arrogant, blinding obsession with the family bloodline had created a massive, catastrophic legal loophole. The prenup specifically stated that Vanessa would receive a highly generous, multi-million-dollar settlement and a permanent 50% ownership stake in the primary residential estate if she successfully produced Davenport heirs. The legal document completely failed to specify that those heirs had to be biologically fathered by Julian himself. Because Darius was a legitimate blood-born Davenport, the twin boys legally fulfilled the exact, literal requirements of the written contract. Vanessa had technically delivered the Davenport heirs she was contracted to produce, regardless of which brother had actually supplied the genetics. Armed with this undeniable, airtight legal technicality, Vanessa's lawyer immediately filed an aggressive emergency injunction. He successfully froze all of Julian's personal bank accounts, completely locked him out of his own financial portfolios, and secured an immediate court-ordered eviction notice barring Julian from ever stepping foot back inside the Buckhead mansion. Vanessa legally claimed half of whatever was left of the crumbling estate, demanding massive retroactive child support and staggering emotional damages for the alleged physical and psychological abuse she suffered during the brutal brawl. She effectively stripped Julian of his luxurious home, his vast money, and his remaining public dignity before he even had a chance to wash his own brother's dried blood off his bruised knuckles. When Julian finally walked out of the downtown police precinct, blinking furiously against the harsh afternoon sunlight, he was a completely broken, destitute man. The corporate board of directors had officially convened and terminated his position as chief executive officer, cutting off his massive executive salary and permanently severing his access to the unlimited company credit cards. When he desperately tried to call his mother for financial help, the call went straight to her automated voicemail. Vivian completely blamed Julian for the public destruction of their pristine image. She simply could not forgive him for brawling on the floor like a common uncultured criminal in front of the local police and the entire elite neighborhood. She effectively disowned him, changing the security codes to her private townhouse and explicitly ordering her remaining staff to turn him away if he showed up. Julian was forced to hail a cheap, battered taxicab and check into a miserable, rundown motel on the desolate outskirts of the city. The man who had spent his entire adult life wearing custom Italian suits, driving imported sports cars, and drinking exceptionally rare scotch, was now sitting on a sagging, stained mattress, in a room that smelled strongly of cheap bleach and stale cigarette smoke. He had absolutely nothing left in the world. The high society friends who used to eagerly kiss his ring and attend his lavish parties now openly mocked his mugshot on the internet. The younger brother he had grown up with had stolen his manipulative wife. The controlling mother who had dictated his every move had completely abandoned him to the hungry wolves. He was completely isolated, drowning in a suffocating dark ocean of public shame and total financial ruin. It was during his third consecutive miserable night in that depressing motel room, heavily fueled by cheap corner store liquor and overwhelming, crushing despair, that Julian's mind completely snapped. He opened his cracked smartphone, his thumb hovering anxiously over the social media applications he had previously avoided out of pure humiliation. In his twisted, desperate, agonizing state, he sought out the only person he believed he could still mentally control: me. He typed my name into the digital search bar, fully expecting to find a pathetic, depressed woman struggling to survive in a tiny, cramped apartment, endlessly mourning the devastating loss of her wealthy, powerful Atlanta husband. He desperately wanted to look at my supposed misery, just to make himself feel slightly better about his own catastrophic, humiliating downfall. Instead, the search engine returned a massive, blinding wave of high-profile international press coverage. Julian stared at the glowing mobile screen, his bloodshot, exhausted eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock. The top search result was not a tragic, sympathetic update about a lonely, discarded divorcee. It was a massive digital spread from the latest, highly anticipated issue of European Vogue. He clicked the bold link, his hands shaking violently, as the high-resolution, professionally captured image slowly loaded on his cracked screen. There I was, standing gracefully on the sprawling balcony of my luxurious Mayfair penthouse, overlooking the stunning, brightly lit London skyline. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed haute couture gown that cost more than his current annual salary, my hair perfectly styled, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable, magnificent power. The bold, striking headline beneath the glamorous photograph read, "The New Queen of the European Art Market," detailing exactly how my elite consulting firm had just brokered a record-breaking, multi-million-pound acquisition for a prominent global tech billionaire. The extensive article lavishly praised my ruthless business acumen, my sophisticated elegance, and my massive, rapidly expanding personal net worth. There was absolutely no mention of my traumatic past in Atlanta. There was no mention of the disgraced Davenport family. I had completely transcended their petty, toxic, insignificant world. Julian sat in the dark, suffocating motel room, staring blankly at my triumphant photograph for hours on end. A normal, rational human being would have looked at that glowing article and instantly realized they had made a massive, unforgivable, life-ruining mistake. They would have accepted their devastating defeat, closed the phone, and tried to figure out how to quietly rebuild their shattered life. But Julian was entirely lacking in rationality. His fragile ego had been so severely battered and violently destroyed over the past week that his broken brain desperately constructed a completely delusional, wildly inaccurate alternate reality, just to survive the crushing psychological trauma of his current existence. He completely convinced himself that my massive, undeniable success was actually an elaborate, desperate cry for his help. He looked at the $5 million I had brilliantly used to build my international empire and somehow twisted the factual narrative in his sick mind. He told himself that I had only taken the hush money because I was deeply hurt by his mother, cruel lies, not because I actually wanted to leave him forever. He convinced his desperate heart that I was still madly, unconditionally in love with him, secretly waiting in my European castle for him to finally break free from his toxic family and come rushing back to me. In his completely fractured, delusional mind, I was not a powerful, independent, self-made billionaire. I was just a heartbroken, loyal wife securely holding onto his wealth, desperately keeping a warm seat ready for him at the absolute top of the financial world. He reasoned wildly that if he could just see me in person, if he could just look deeply into my eyes and tearfully explain how Vanessa and his manipulative mother had completely tricked him, I would instantly forgive everything that had happened. He genuinely, pathetically believed I would welcome him back with wide open arms, happily hand over the keys to my massive European business empire, and effortlessly save him from his miserable, ruined, lonely existence. The sheer magnitude of his toxic delusion was absolutely terrifying, but it gave his empty life a desperate, frantic, burning sense of purpose. Julian frantically checked his old dormant airline loyalty accounts. His corporate travel cards had been permanently frozen, and his personal bank accounts were completely drained dry by Vanessa-aggressive lawyers. But he suddenly remembered he still possessed a massive, unused stockpile of frequent flyer miles from his previous years of flying first class around the world for the Davenport Fund. He rapidly logged into the airline digital portal, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, and anxiously checked the remaining balances. He had exactly enough miles left to book a single direct one-way economy ticket to Europe. He looked back at this digital Vogue article glowing brightly on his phone screen. The final descriptive paragraph casually mentioned that I would be attending a highly exclusive, heavily guarded invite-only gala in Paris the following weekend to publicly celebrate the grand opening of a massive new contemporary art exhibition. That minor detail was all the confirmation his delusional, desperate mind needed. He did not bother to pack a suitcase because he literally had no clean clothes left to pack. He did not write a goodbye note for his furious mother, or his bleeding brother, because they were entirely permanently dead to him now. He simply grabbed his crumpled American passport, walked out of the miserable-smelling motel room, and hailed a passing cab directly to the massive international terminal at the Atlanta airport. As he hurriedly boarded the crowded commercial flight to France, wearing the exact same wrinkled, dirty, blood-stained designer suit he had been violently arrested in days prior, Julian felt a sick, twisted, entirely misplaced sense of imminent triumph. He foolishly thought he was flying directly toward his ultimate financial and romantic salvation. He arrogantly thought he was about to effortlessly reclaim his rightful throne and his endlessly loyal, wealthy wife. He had absolutely no idea that he was willingly, eagerly walking directly into a perfectly designed, inescapable slaughterhouse. He did not know a single thing about Dominic Banks. He did not know about the massive, lethal financial trap we had already carefully set for his rapidly failing investment company. And he certainly did not know about the healthy, growing child currently resting safely inside my womb. Julian Davenport was flying across the Atlantic Ocean to arrogantly demand his perfect life back from a woman who had already permanently, gleefully buried him. The crisp, golden sunlight of a perfect French afternoon spilled across the meticulously manicured gardens of the Château de Villette. It was exactly 1 week after Julian had boarded his desperate, pathetic flight from Atlanta. I was standing in the center of the massive master bridal suite, surrounded by centuries-old woven tapestries, soaring vaulted ceilings, and priceless antique furniture. Today was my wedding day. I looked at my reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror with its ornate gold frame, barely recognizing the incredibly powerful woman staring back at me. I was draped in a breathtaking custom-designed silk wedding gown, the delicate imported fabric perfectly tailored to accentuate the beautiful, undeniable curve of my 6-month baby bump. Dominic had spared absolutely no expense, renting out the entire historic private estate for a massive multi-day celebration. Outside the tall arched glass windows, hundreds of Europe's most influential tech moguls, prominent art dealers, and wealthy aristocrats were gathering in the cobblestone courtyard, sipping vintage champagne and waiting for me to walk down the aisle. I was not just a bride preparing for a ceremony. I was the new matriarch of a rapidly expanding dynasty completely surrounded by immense wealth, genuine unconditional love, and absolute security. My private makeup artist was just finishing the final delicate touches on my lipstick when she politely stepped out of the room to fetch my custom floral bouquet, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of the suite. I rested my hands gently on my stomach, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from my unborn daughter. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, calming breath of the fresh lavender-scented air blowing softly through the open balcony doors. But that perfect, tranquil silence was suddenly and violently shattered. The heavy, solid mahogany doors of my bridal suite were forcefully shoved open, slamming incredibly hard against the ancient stone wall with a deafening crack. I spun around immediately, fully expecting to see my frantic wedding planner rushing in with a minor last-minute scheduling update. Instead, I found myself staring directly at a literal ghost from my deeply buried past. Julian stood in the doorway, his chest heaving violently as he gasped for air like a drowning man. He looked absolutely horrifying. The man who had once been the polished, arrogant, untouchable prince of Atlanta high society was entirely unrecognizable. His face was covered in dark, yellowing, ugly bruises from his brutal, highly publicized fistfight with his brother Darius. He was severely unshaven, his jaw covered in rough, unkempt stubble. His eyes were completely bloodshot wild with manic energy and sunken deep into his skull from severe sleep deprivation. He was wearing the exact same tailored designer suit he had been violently arrested in days prior, now completely wrinkled, heavily stained with dried dark blood, and smelling strongly of cheap alcohol and stale airport sweat. I would later learn exactly how he had managed to bypass the heavy armed private security at the front gates of the chateau. He had aggressively blended in with a massive group of local florists, delivering large decorative arrangements, using his loud, entitled American arrogance to bully a confused young French vendor into letting him slip through the busy service entrance. He had spent hours wandering the massive, confusing grounds like a rabid feral animal until he finally located my private suite. Julian stepped into the room, kicking the heavy wooden doors shut behind him with his expensive scuffed leather shoe. He looked wildly around the opulent, multi-million-dollar bridal suite, his frantic eyes taking in the massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, the dozens of imported white orchids decorating the tables, and the expensive crushed velvet furniture. He had flown all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, spending his absolute last remaining frequent flyer miles, genuinely expecting to find me sitting in a dark, depressing room. He had convinced his heavily fractured mind that my massive European success was a total lie, an elaborate public relations stunt designed solely to hide my profound misery and loneliness. He fully expected me to be weeping over his memory, desperate for his rescue, and ready to hand over my new fortune to save him from his spectacular ruin. But as his bloodshot, manic eyes finally landed on me, standing in the center of the room, his entire delusional fantasy instantly evaporated into thin air. He froze completely, his body going completely rigid. He stared intensely at the custom white silk wedding gown cascading down my body. He stared at the massive, flawless, multi-carat diamond engagement ring resting heavily on my left hand. And then his eyes slowly drifted downward, locking directly onto the unmistakable, perfectly rounded curve of my pregnant stomach. The sheer, unadulterated shock on his face was almost comical to witness. His jaw went entirely slack, dropping open in absolute disbelief. He took a shaky, unstable step backward as if an invisible force had just physically struck him directly in the chest. For a brief, pathetic moment, I thought he might actually break down and cry right there on the antique rug. I thought the crushing reality of his absolute, undeniable defeat had finally pierced through his incredibly thick, arrogant skull. He was looking at the exact life he had always demanded, a beautiful, wealthy wife, carrying a healthy child, but it completely belonged to another man. But Julian was entirely incapable of genuine self-reflection or accountability. His fragile, toxic ego, already brutally battered and completely destroyed by Vanessa and his manipulative mother back in Atlanta, simply could not handle the undeniable visual proof of my total victory. To protect his shattered, desperate mind from completely collapsing, he instantly defaulted to the absolute only defense mechanism he knew: pure, venomous, hateful hostility. His bruised face twisted into an ugly, terrifying sneer. The initial shock instantly melted into a blinding, completely irrational rage. He pointed a shaking, filthy finger directly at my stomach. "So this is why you took the money." He spat, his voice echoing sharply and violently in the quiet stone room. "You were sleeping with some European trash the entire time we were married." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting protectively over my baby. I did not flinch away from his anger. I did not scream for my armed security team stationed at the end of the hallway. I simply looked at him with an overwhelming sense of cold, detached, absolute pity. He was so completely pathetic, so entirely consumed by his own toxic narcissism and deep-seated misogyny, that he was actively trying to twist my glorious, beautiful reality into another one of his disgusting, manipulative lies. He took another aggressive, threatening step toward me, his voice rising from a harsh whisper to a frantic, unhinged shout. "You played the tragic victim perfectly in my dining room, Nia. You sat there acting like you were so heartbroken about your permanent infertility. You made me feel sorry for you while you were just waiting to cash out and run off with your secret lover. You stole $5 million from my family. You stole my mother money to fund this ridiculous, pathetic charade." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that held absolutely no humor, only deep, agonizing bitterness. "You think you won because you found some rich idiot to buy you a pretty white dress. Whose bastard child is that, Nia? Tell me which arrogant European fool you spread your legs for while you were living in my house pretending to be a loyal, faithful wife. You are nothing but a gold-digging fraud? And I'm going to walk right out there and tell your new husband exactly what kind of manipulative trash he is marrying." Julian stood there, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides, completely convinced that he had just uncovered some massive, scandalous conspiracy. He genuinely believed his angry accusations. In his twisted mind, it was the only logical explanation for my sudden pregnancy, because accepting the alternative meant accepting his own profound biological failure. He wanted to drag me down into the filthy, humiliating mud where he currently lived. He wanted to ruin my perfect wedding day just like his own fraudulent marriage had been ruined. He looked at me with pure hatred, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to frantically beg him to keep his mouth shut. He thought he finally held the upper hand. He had absolutely no idea that I was holding the ultimate devastating medical truth, and I was about to use it to completely obliterate whatever tiny fraction of his sanity still remained. I watched him panting like a cornered animal, letting his pathetic insults wash over me without causing a single ripple of genuine emotion. I had waited 8 long months for this precise moment. I had planned for it, anticipated it, and built my entire financial strategy around it. Julian Davenport had aggressively forced his way into my private sanctuary to hurl baseless accusations, but he was about to receive the most brutal, undeniably factual education of his entire miserable existence. I did not scream. I did not flinch. I did not call for the heavily armed security guards stationed just outside my heavy mahogany doors. Instead, I simply looked at his red, bruised face, listened to his unhinged, pathetic accusations, and I started to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle. It was a rich, full, completely relaxed laugh that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of my bridal suite. My laughter completely shattered the aggressive, threatening momentum he had desperately tried to build. Julian stopped yelling, his chest heaving as he stared at me in absolute, profound confusion. He was expecting fear, guilt, or at least angry denial. He was entirely unprepared for my genuine amusement. His bruised face twitched as his fragile ego struggled to process my reaction. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly, losing the commanding edge he had just tried to force upon me. "You think stealing my family money is funny?" I stopped laughing, taking a slow, measured step toward him. The heavy silk of my wedding gown rustled softly against the antique rug. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes, completely stripping away the invisible pedestal he had stood on for his entire life. "Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm and dripping with absolute lethal certainty. "Did your manipulative, controlling mother ever actually tell you why I signed those divorce papers so easily? Did she ever tell you why I took that $5 million check and walked out of your massive house without shedding a single tear?" He glared at me, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Because you are a gold digger," he spat, repeating the tired, pathetic insult his mother had drilled into his brain. "Because you wanted to run away with your European billionaire." I shook my head slowly, feeling an overwhelming wave of pity for the sheer magnitude of his ignorance. "No, Julian. I walked away because I knew the absolute truth. I walked away because I knew that Vanessa was pregnant, and I knew with absolute biological certainty that you were not the father of those babies." Julian froze. His entire body went completely rigid, as if he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. The arrogant sneer on his face instantly melted into a look of sheer panicked terror. The events of the hospital waiting room back in Atlanta, the undeniable DNA test, his brother confessing his mother betraying him, all of it must have flashed violently through his broken mind. But his desperate brain tried one final time to reject the truth. "You are lying," he whispered, taking a shaky step backward. "You could not have known that. Nobody knew that." "I knew it, Julian," I replied smoothly, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away from him. "Because unlike you, I did not just blindly trust Dr. Wallace. When I came to London, I collapsed at a gala. I was taken to an elite private hospital where a team of incredibly competent specialists ran a completely new set of extensive medical scans. Do you want to know what they found? They found a perfectly healthy, completely flawless reproductive system. I was never infertile. I never had severe ovarian scarring. I never needed any of those expensive toxic pills Dr. Wallace forced me to swallow." Julian shook his head frantically, his breathing becoming incredibly shallow and rapid. "No," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "No, Dr. Wallace showed us the scans. He showed us the biopsy results." "Dr. Wallace showed you forged documents paid for by your mother." I shot back, my voice rising slightly, cutting through his pathetic denial like a sharp blade. "Your mother paid him $750,000 to completely fabricate my medical records. And do you want to know why she did it, Julian? Do you want to know the massive, ugly secret she was willing to destroy my entire life to hide?" I turned away from him and walked over to my heavy antique writing desk. I opened the top drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder my private investigator had delivered to me 8 months ago. I carried it back across the room and shoved it directly against his chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to grab it, holding the heavy file as if it were a live grenade. "Open it," I commanded. Julian's fingers were trembling violently as he slowly opened the manila folder. The very first document inside was the highly classified, heavily encrypted medical file bearing his exact name. I watched his eyes scan the clinical terminology highlighted in bright yellow ink. I watched his bruised face drain of all remaining color, turning a sickly ashen gray. "You have non-obstructive azoospermia," I said, speaking the clinical words clearly and deliberately, ensuring they carved themselves permanently into his shattered ego. "You produce zero sperm, Julian. You are completely genetically incapable of fathering a child. You always have been. The infection you suffered as a teenager completely sterilized you. Your mother always knew you were completely defective. She knew her precious golden boy could never produce the heirs she desperately demanded to secure the Davenport legacy. So she bought you a fake diagnosis. She made me the scapegoat so your fragile masculine pride would not completely shatter in front of your wealthy country club friends. She orchestrated the affair between Vanessa and your brother Darius, just to produce babies that carried the Davenport blood, and she paid me $5 million to disappear before you ever figured out you were shooting blanks." Julian stared at the medical documents in his shaking hands. He read the irrefutable evidence of his own biological failure. He saw the scanned copies of the massive wire transfers his mother had sent to Dr. Wallace. The massive, indestructible fortress of his ego completely collapsed in real time. The Prince of Atlanta, the arrogant chief executive officer who had built his entire identity on his perceived superiority, suddenly realized he was nothing more than a pathetic, manipulated pawn in his mother's sick, twisted game. The heavy folder slipped from his trembling fingers, the papers scattering across the beautiful antique rug. Julian's legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees in the center of my bridal suite. A horrible, agonizing sound ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. He buried his face in his dirty hands and began to sob violently. His shoulders shook with the massive force of his weeping. It was a pathetic, deeply humiliating display of total defeat. He was mourning the absolute loss of his manhood, his marriage, his family, and his entire grasp on reality. I stood over him, looking down at the broken man who had once allowed his family to treat me like defective garbage. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I felt no urge to comfort him. I simply waited for his violent sobbing to subside into quiet, pathetic gasps for air. When he finally looked up at me, his face wet with tears, and his eyes begging for some tiny fraction of mercy, I delivered the absolute final blow. "You came here today thinking you could hurl insults at me?" I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "You came here thinking you could ruin my wedding day and drag me back down into your miserable, ruined life. But you completely forgot who you were dealing with, Julian. You forgot that I am a businesswoman. And I recognize a highly profitable exit when I see one." He stared at me, his chest heaving, completely unable to form a single coherent word. "By the way," I continued, offering him a slow, chilling smile, "that $5 million check your mother so generously handed me across your dining room table. I did not just use it to buy pretty dresses and rent this beautiful chateau. I gave every single penny of it to my fiancé. Dominic runs one of the most ruthless, aggressive financial firms in Europe. And for the last 8 months, while you were busy playing house with another man, children, and getting violently arrested on your front lawn, Dominic and I used your mother hush money to aggressively short the failing stock of the Davenport Fund." Julian's eyes widened in absolute horror as the sheer magnitude of my words finally registered in his fractured brain. "When your massive scandal leaked to the press and your conservative investors panicked, we were the ones waiting in the shadows," I explained smoothly, relishing every single syllable. "We bought up your massive corporate debt for absolute pennies on the dollar. We acquired controlling interest through a network of anonymous offshore holding companies. We orchestrated the entire liquidity crisis that just completely destroyed your family empire." "No," Julian whimpered, shaking his head frantically. "No, you cannot do that. The board would never allow it." "The board has already approved the hostile takeover," Julian Frez replied, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "The paperwork was finalized yesterday morning. I do not just own my own life now. Dominic and I legally own the Davenport Fund. We own the commercial real estate. We own the investment portfolios. We own the very legacy your mother sacrificed my sanity to protect." I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his tear-stained, bruised cheek. "You work for me now, Julian," I whispered. "Or rather, you did. Because as the new majority shareholder, my very first executive action was restructuring the corporate leadership. You are officially fired. Your massive severance package will be exactly $0. You have absolutely nothing left." Julian remained kneeling on the floor, his mouth opening and closing silently, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his absolute ruin. He had lost the physical fight against his brother, but I had just completely annihilated his entire existence. The ultimate clapback was not a loud argument or a physical altercation. It was the quiet, undeniable sound of a pen signing the legal documents that transferred his entire family empire directly into my hands. "Now get out of my suite!" I ordered, my voice hardening into solid steel. "I have a wedding to attend and you are dirtying my carpet." I turned my back on him, completely dismissing his pathetic existence, and walked toward the open balcony doors to wait for my security team to drag the trash out of my beautiful French chateau. He was permanently erased from my future forever. I was finally entirely free to build a magnificent, beautiful dynasty that truly belonged to me.